Well done. Okay, great. Then it's my pleasure now to turn to the real business of the morning and introduce the first plenary speaker. Dr. Tara Plewa received her PhD in geography from the University of South Carolina. Her supervisor there was Will Graff. You may know him. She specializes in fluvial geomorphology. That is her field. She just told me rivers are her love. She's now working in Geographic Information Systems, Watershed Science, and Water Policy at the Army National Guard in South Carolina. Her dissertation, which we're going to hear about today, very appropriate location to hear about this topic, and we got a nice prelude to Tara's plenary talk last night when we heard from the mayor and about the living river of the project that's going on here. Tara will greatly amplify those messages today. Her dissertation explored the natural and cultural history of the Santa Fe River over the last 4 centuries. Her title, A Trickle Runs Through It, An Environmental History of the Santa Fe River, New Mexico. Tara Plewa.
Good morning, everyone. Bienvenidos. Welcome to Santa Fe. 2010 is a special year for Santa Fe. It commemorates its Cuarto Centenario, 400 years as a governmental, ecclesiastical, and military center. And so, since it's the first U.S. capital to reach this milestone, it is indeed, like its slogan says, city different. The city itself began to take on its current look around the time of statehood in 1912. At that time, Santa Fe was actually losing population because the railroad decided to bypass the city because of topographic challenges. And so the city decided to reinvent itself as a cultural center and a center for art. And it began to cast aside some of the architectural hodgepodge that had come in with the Anglo-Americans and adopted this style, the Santa Fe Pueblo style. And what this does is this invokes a feeling of both visitors and residents that the past landscape was based on an environmental harmony and that the buildings actually fit well within their environment. But the past was anything but harmonious. Santa Fe looked more like a melting cake. The streets were dusty and dirty. It was very difficult to survive here. The climate was often described as 8 months of winter and 4 months of hell. But survive they did, and through the toils of irrigated agriculture that was supplied by the river, this is the earliest map that survives of Santa Fe. This is from 1767. You can see the river flowing from right to left, and there are 2 acequias, or irrigation canals, that delivered water to the fields. These canals were unlined gravity ditches that would distribute water through their main ditches called madres and into laterals through a series of gates, or compuertas, that were opened and closed by the farmers, so that each farmer received some water, equitably and beneficially, regardless of how much was available. This tradition was an oral tradition. People learned by passing it down from parent to child, as you can see in this picture that was taken in the 1940s in Santa Fe. The farmer artistically moves water across his field in a very fine sheet so that rills aren't created on the landscape. And this is quite an art form if you were to try to do this yourself. It's quite difficult. And so they grew the traditional crops of corn, beans, hay, and squash, orchards, and vegetable gardens. And this way of life sustained the people for over 350 years until the arrival of Anglo-Americans and the installation of several dams. And so this presentation is going to give you the history of the river, not in a chronology, but instead through thematic ways. I'm going to talk about the hydrology of the river and flow, the fluvial geomorphology in form, and river function. So the Santa Fe River flows from east to west for about 46 miles. It crosses a watershed that's 258 square miles. It lies in the center of the state in northern New Mexico. There are climatic signals that affect the watershed. The upper watershed is the only gaining reach, and it's mainly supplied by snowmelt. There are some North American monsoons that will deliver water in the summertime, but there are also climatic periodicities that affect the watershed, mainly both warm and cold ENSO and PEDO. And on to flow. How can we know about Santa Fe River flow prior to 1913 when the first gauge was installed? Well, thankfully for researchers like myself, there's a wonderful tree ring chronology that's done within the watershed at the Arroyo Hondo. And so I was able to convert the tree ring data into annual stream flow on an annual basis, and this actually elucidates what was going on in the watershed from a human perspective, given the fact that most people were agriculturalists. And though even acequia farming was a very rudimentary technology, that does not mean it was a minimalistic in its effect. And so we now know, because of the tree ring data, we can know about the degree of farming stress or success. For example, in 1666, we know there was a drought. There is a recorded history about Santa Fe needing to import food. But what the tree ring data tells us, which is now converted to stream flow, is that 7 out of the 10 preceding years and 4 of the years that followed were also exceedingly dry. And so now we know a little bit more about the human experience and why perhaps the Pueblo Revolt happened in 1680. Another example occurs in 1696, when the colonists petitioned the viceroy in desperation, and they said, "We are at the point of perishing from our raging hunger. Everything that has been planted is lost because of the great drought that has occurred. It has been necessary to dig wells by hand in the Cienega just to provide drinking water for the villa." And so in 1696, according to the stream flow data, there is a very strong cold ENSO that occurs with predicted river flow below 1 standard deviation. And so now we are able to know a little bit more about what was going on and elucidate more about the human experience. Gerges and Fowler in 2009 put together the longest record of El Nino and La Nina events, and I was able to compare that with the stream flow record that I had converted to z-scores. And what it shows is that between 1600 and 1750, there are very few flows that actually go above the mean, and quite a few that go below. After 1750, it's theorized that the Pacific Decadal Oscillation changes and amplitudes increase. So prior to 1750, farmers had a very difficult time irrigating their crops. Because in Santa Fe we know that approximately 4.5 acre-feet of water is applied per acre to the fields, we can then convert that annual stream flow value to the amount of acres in agriculture that could have been irrigated on an annual basis. And so in years when standard deviation was below 2, we now know that only about 730 acres could be irrigated, which really does tell us a lot about what life was like in Santa Fe and how difficult it was to survive here. And so the effects of the acequias were not minimal. Spiegel and Baldwin estimate that about half of the water that was applied to the field actually returned to the river via subsurface flow. And so every year, over 2.5 trillion gallons of water was applied to the fields in Santa Fe, which equates to over 1 cubic kilometer of water being applied to the valley of Santa Fe over a 300-year period. This is a monumental volume of water for such a tiny valley. And so that saturated aquifer actually contributed to the base flow of the river and influenced past flow geography. Historians debate whether or not the river flowed perennially from its headwaters to its mouth on an annual basis. This research indicates that it was only in the wettest years that the river actually made it all the way to the Rio Grande. What this shows also is that it was the presence of reverse faults that actually created a hydrologic daisy chain down the river and allowed the river to appear like it was flowing because of the upstream meltwater, but that was not the case. What you can see is in this picture on the right is a fault that is ramping water to the surface. The river is flowing from right to left, and on the right of the fault you can see that there's moist ground and there are plants, and to the left it's dry. And so it is the presence of these faults that would strategically place the small ranchos and villas that were popping up amongst the watershed. Things changed with the arrival of the United States. They thought that dams would help civilize Santa Fe, so there were a series of installations over a period of 60 years. This graphic shows the locations of the 4 dams in the upper watershed. The 2 dams to the left, Old Stone and 2 Mile, are no longer there, but the upper 2, Nichols and McClure, hold about 5,000 acre-feet of water. The annual flow in the river is about 8,000 acre-feet, and so you'd think that some would flow downstream to the Acequias and to the river. But unfortunately, we in the public use that water almost as quickly as it goes into the reservoirs, so there really is none available downstream. So over a period of 60 years, the water that was considered a God-given right to the Acequia communities was categorically denied over time. And so after fighting a losing battle, they almost pretty much gave up, to be honest. And this expanse of agriculture was reduced slowly over time, as was that subsurface flow engine. And so in 1914, we know that about 1,200 acres of hay and orchards throughout the valley were being irrigated. And now less than 100 are irrigated today. The hydrologic effects of dams were not minimal. Mainly what we see is that there is a significant reduction in flow, obviously, but variability increases substantially. This radial plot of variance shows that the spring flow used to be spread out amongst a series of months, and now, if any water is released to the river, it is focused on the month of May. And so this graph shows that the 2 blue lines that you see, the dashed line occurred before the dams went in, and the solid line occurs after. And so that area between the 2 lines could actually be spaced out to better mimic nature if we were to operate the dams more sustainably. And so the current geography of Santa Fe River flow is as follows. The upper watershed in purple is perennial down to the dams. From there, the green indicates the area where the river is ephemeral, mainly receiving storm flow from the streets of Santa Fe. The river again becomes perennial along the blue line, where the wastewater treatment plant currently dumps about 13 million gallons of effluent into the channel every day. And so the yellow star in the maps indicates where we are here to give you a spatial context of the watershed. And now on to the fluvial geomorphology of the watershed. Geology is incredibly important in determining river form in Santa Fe. The upper part of the watershed is part of the Sangre de Cristos, the lower part of the Rocky Mountains. The middle third of the watershed is part of the Rio Grande Rift and is full of about 2,000 feet of sedimentary material. Then the lower third of the watershed is actually basaltic rock that was extruded during the Valles caldera. The longitudinal profile shows the very steep upper watershed and the significant change in slope that occurs at the change in the physiographic province. At this location, ironically right where downtown is, the river begins to dissipate its energy and begins to meander and braid. So it changes form quite dramatically right where town is located. It continues to braid downstream until it intersects with the basaltic canyon of the Caja del Rio, until it intersects with the Rio Grande. And so I'm going to give you a little visual tour of the fluvial geomorphology of the watershed, perhaps what it would look like before dams were installed and humans began to change it so drastically. The upper watershed is a very archetypal mountain stream. It's a very ecologically healthy system. Embeddedness is low. The banks are quite stable. And it's quite beautiful. And unfortunately, only about 1% of people have ever seen this that are currently alive, because the upper watershed has been closed to all public entry since 1932 to protect the water supply. And so it's quite rare to actually see it. As the river approaches the mountain front, it changes drastically in slope and begins to meander within its floodplain. As it begins to approach town, the sediment volume increases because it begins to pick up more sediments from that which is sloughed off of the mountains as part of the Rio Grande Trough. And in town is actually more of a compound channel. This picture taken in 1914 gives you an idea, with the bridge in the background, of what the spring flow melt used to deliver to downtown Santa Fe. The height and width of the bridge gives you an idea of how big those spring snowmelts used to be. As the river exits town, it begins to receive contributions from other arroyos. The slope changes and it begins to braid because of the excess sediment. The river changes again in form as it approaches the La Bajada, or the basaltic canyon. The sediment load decreases because of the change in geology, and the amount of base flow increases. At this location, there are a series of faults, and the river begins to meander through the tight canyon. As it exits the canyon, it intersects the sediments of the Rio Grande floodplain and begins to braid once more. And so this form adjusts in time because of the effects of humans. The biggest effect of dam installation. The water that is released from the dams is completely sediment-free, and because it tries to rebalance its sediment load, it begins to incise and narrow. Because of the reduced stream power, the bed begins to armor, and because there is no available sediment, it actually begins to cut at its banks. Around 1912, the sandy, dusty roads of Santa Fe were converted to pavement. And at that time, the river became the main stormwater conduit for the town. Around this same time, the residents of Santa Fe started to notice that the bed and banks of the river were degrading. And so during Roosevelt's second New Deal, the Works Progress Administration was brought in to construct the walls along the sides of the channel, which you will see if you walk up and down the river today. There was a really serious drought in 1946, and so the first municipal well was installed along the river. It's at this time that the gaining stream conditions were reversed for the first time, and the river became a losing stream. And like the mayor mentioned last night, between the 1950s and 1980s, the river was actually encouraged to incise. Land values in Santa Fe were increasing, and so they wanted to build in as much as they could, and allowing the river to incise allowed it to capture and contain its flood flows and allow for development to occur up to its edge. Here's some pictures of what the river looked like in 1960 and today. As you can see, there isn't much change given the fact that we control the hydrologic regime upstream. The picture on the right gives you a sense of the incision that was allowed to occur between 1950 and 1980. You can see this incision as you walk along the river during your stay here in Santa Fe. Other adjustments made serious changes in the river as well. About 12 miles downstream, starting in around 1930-1940, during which the paving of the roads, aggregate mining began in earnest, and approximately 180,000 dump trucks of material was removed from the Santa Fe River downstream. And so this Nick Point migration made for a very serious problem, which I'll show you some pictures of in just a second. It was about this time as well that the first wastewater treatment plant discharges began to enter the channel. And so you had a braided ephemeral system downstream that was now changed to a completely perennial system and is now a single thread. And so here is what the incision and Nick Point migration, because of the sand and gravel mines, did to the river downstream beyond Agua Fria. The two pictures on the top show you about 35 to 40 feet of incision that's happened in that location. On the lower right, this is what taken below the wastewater treatment plant. In this location, the river's actually a grading because the finest materials aren't picked up by sand and gravel mines, and they're washed downstream. And so you're actually having problems with flooding, and the local people have built levees to try and deal with the aggrading river. So I digitized the active floodplain between 1936 and 2008 and was able to calculate between these years the river incised and narrowed over 80%. The main function of the Santa Fe River for the first 350 years of settlement was irrigated agriculture. This picture, taken at the turn of the 20th century, shows what the fields used to look like up and down the valley. Unfortunately, most of the Acequia network is now gone. It's beneath subdivisions and modern infrastructure. There's only about 7 miles left. But through 3 geographic techniques, the rectification and digitization of some historic maps, using a flow accumulation grid generated from LIDAR, and some remote sensing techniques, I was able to reconstruct over 50 miles of acequias. So these are where the acequias are now. There's only about 7 miles left, and I encourage you, as part of your tour of the city, to go and walk along the Acequia Madre. If you go up Canyon Road and turn right on Acequia Madre Street, you'll notice the ditch that flows along the street to the left. Through those techniques, about 50 miles were reconstructed, and it gives you an idea of what the true agricultural sense of the valley was like. An extension of the river that was historically significant was the Cienega complex. The mayor mentioned that nearby was a swamp. Cienega means swamp or marsh in Spanish. And so this Cienega, through this research, was shown to actually be a past oxbow of the river, not just simply seepage from the local hillsides. This picture on the lower right, it was taken from Fort Marcy in the late 1860s. And if you climb Fort Marcy Hill and look across to the cathedral, you can now see the differences in the landscape. There's mostly pavement and buildings now. But in this picture, you can actually still see standing water. The Cienega was incredibly significant to local Santa Feans. It was a source of water for acequias, and during that 1696 drought, they actually dug wells by hand in it in order for the public to have any water to drink. It was also a community pasture land, and it was actually the source of a tiny tributary called the Rio Chiquito. The Rio Chiquito was not a side channel of the river like some believe. And lastly, there was a parochial pond that was dug in the Cienega, the source of which was a series of springs. And so to give you some context of where you are, you can see the yellow star. The Cienega was the hatched polygon. This was created through soil testing and this gunky organic muck under the landscape of Santa Fe. The Cienega is still degassing, and it causes all sorts of problems with the streets buckling and cracking. There are several parking garages that actually had to be built through a floating type architecture. But it contained a series of springs, the parochial pond, which was the source of the Rio Chiquito. About 1880, the Rio Chiquito became Water Street. And so if you visit the Cathedral of St. Francis and turn right, take a tour down Water Street, experience the grade, and envision what a wet Santa Fe used to be. This used to be a tiny little creek. And during settlement of the Anglos, they decided when the commissioners and committee get through with it, it will be vastly improved. Behind the cathedral was also New Mexico's Garden of Eden. Supposedly, apples grew here the size of basketballs and all sorts of things that, of course, were not real. But however, it was an extremely beautiful, lush garden. The bishops dug this pond mainly because during Lent they needed a fish food source, and so they grew carp in this pond for Lent. If you walk back there now, what you'll notice is, of course, a parking lot. Isn't that what we do to all of our paradises? Luckily, however, in the 1940s, before the St. Francis School was constructed, a engineering plot of the pond and the locations of what types of trees and their diameters were noted on the plot. And so I rectified and digitized this, and so I was able to recreate the garden both in 2D and in 3D. So I encourage you to walk into the back of the parochial parking lot and look at the cathedral and try to envision what Santa Fe's lush gardens used to look like. And so last night, if you were here, you had heard about the mayor's Living River initiative and trying to put water back into the river. We all know as scientists that it takes more than water to make a living river. And so there are several restoration challenges here in Santa Fe. In the context of flow, first, the landscape has been converted from fields to vast subdivisions, parking lots, areas of pavement. And so we're never going to return that landscape to its previous condition. Therefore, the fact that water from irrigated agriculture elevated the base flow in the river, it's actually also now elevated expectations for restoration and what the river should be. And because the dams are simply storage and diversion dams, they don't have a minimum in-stream flow requirement. They don't need to be relicensed through FERC. And so there's no way to enforce a downstream flow. And lastly, the flashy hydrologic regime and problems with stormwater management, and in my opinion, are the most severe challenge here in Santa Fe. In terms of form, the restoration that's been happening thus far is neither befitting the present landscape, nor is it recreating the past channel. It's actually picking an archetypal river from a picture in a book and saying, we would like that river to look and be in this landscape. So they don't quite fit. It's also a sediment-starved system. And so in order to bring river forms back into the river and provide habitat for ecosystems, we have a challenge. Where do we get the sediment from? The effects of the aggregate mines are severe. That incision causes a major challenge for restoration. And lastly, function. The built landscape here in Santa Fe leaves little room for change. There are little opportunities to store stormwater in basins and allow it to percolate to groundwater. This will give you an idea of the flashy hydrologic regime and the stormwater challenge that's currently here in Santa Fe. This picture was taken in 1957, and you can see the flood front that's coming down the river towards you. This is a reality for Santa Feans, and until the stormwater is managed properly, I don't think that restoration will be as successful as most desire. Here's another picture from 2008. This is only 3 miles downstream to give you an idea of the volume of water that can be quickly generated during this flashy system. And so here in Santa Fe, you have restoration efforts that are selective. And they're based on the myth of past environmental harmony that is fed by the historicity and the present scene in the city. And it's the current human perceptions that drive aspirations to construct an archetypal river that fits within the current fabricated scene here in Santa Fe. But actually, a framework for restoration should consider both present and future conditions, given the fact that Santa Fe will continue to grow and there are unknowns in terms of global climate change. And so the Santa Fe River will never again be what it once was, and it never was what it is envisioned to have been. And so I encourage you, during your stay here in Santa Fe, to go to the 5 and Dime into the snack bar and get yourself a Frito pie. It's a bag of Fritos with a scoop of chili and some cheese on top, and walk down to the river and sit by a bench and look at the river while a trickle still runs through it. Thank you.